he wasn't very impressed. So finally he asked me a few questions, mostly how long did I work with this system and so on, and departed, saying few words to the director of the laboratory. Later on I found out that what he said was, put his guy to work on something more useful.
In Britain, Baird's row with the BBC continued. An article in The People demanded,
why put off a public test of television?
On October the 9th, 1928, yet another demonstration of Baird television was arranged, especially for the BBC. The day before it was due to take place, the BBC's chief engineer, Peter Eckersley, was ominously sceptical of the Baird system in a confidential memo.
In my opinion, it is the end of their development, not the beginning, and we shall forever be sending heads and shoulders. Are heads and shoulders a service? Is it not, in fact, simply a stunt?
And after the demonstration, Gladstone Murray, the BBC's public relations chief, reported back,
from the angle of service, it would be merely ludicrous if its financial implications did not make it sinister.
But the Post Office thought Baird's system neither ludicrous nor sinister. The BBC's Director General, Sir John Reith, recorded in his diary on November the 6th, after a meeting with the Post Office,
if the BBC doesn't let the Baird have a private show, they threaten that Baird would be given an experimental license, and with speech as well.
And after another demonstration on March the 5th, 1929, in which an old friend of Baird's, Jack Buchanan, took part, the Postmaster General's Committee of Inquiry described Baird's system as a noteworthy scientific achievement and recommended that the BBC should start experimental transmissions with it. Baird was reported as saying that he was going to apply for a television station of his own.
Frankly, we regard the BBC as a rival organization.
By this time, both Baird and the BBC were talking of hostilities. Finally, on June the 26th, 1929, the BBC grudgingly offered Baird 3, later increased to 5, half-hour periods of broadcasting per week outside normal hours. But to the agreement, the BBC added one small but significant clause.
We desire to make it clear that no monopoly can be created for any proprietary system of transmission.
Thus the door had very carefully been left open for another system, and Baird was no longer in sole possession of the field. As far back as 1925, C.F. Jenkins in America had demonstrated the transmission and reception of a picture of a model windmill, but still mechanically. Much more important, Zworykin, with his file of electronic system patents, would shortly be moving to the Radio Corporation of America, a giant corporation headed by yet another Russian emigre, David Sarnoff. Soon, Zworykin would have the colossal power of RCA behind him. In Britain, the Marconi Company were experimenting with the television system, and there were signs of a similar interest by the Gramophone Company. But on September the 30th, 1929, without a cloud in the sky, Baird television went on the air. Baird himself made a brief appearance, describing it as a great day for Britain. It may have seemed so to Baird, but since there was only one transmitter, the picture appeared with no sound at all, merely mouthing faces, and the sound followed later with no picture. Baird was asked how many people were able to receive the program.
Well, there's one receiving set in my home, and I believe the BBC and the Post Office have one. That makes 3. And I should say there are half a dozen other sets in the country. Add to them the receivers that clever amateurs may have built, another 20. That makes 29.
But by March 1930, sound and vision had finally been brought together. Gracie Fields made an appearance, and a television set was installed at number 10 Downing Street for Ramsay MacDonald, who thought it a wonderful miracle. Other viewers who had to pay 25 guineas for their television sets were less enthusiastic. According to one,
the characters appeared to move in a heavy and persistent shower of rain.
On July the 14th, 1930, at 3:30, the first play ever to be performed on television went on the air, introduced by its producer, Lance Sievking. It was Pirandello's The Man with a Flower in His Mouth. The focus was uncertain, and so only one character could be projected at a time, and he could barely move a muscle. Indeed, actors unable to move were the least of Siefking's worries, as 36 years later he remembers.
I persuaded Baird to let me use his big experimental screen that he'd just made. It was about 6 feet high and about 2 feet wide, and it appeared to be made of thousands of little metal coils. But I thought, being a big screen, it would be more fun for the people we'd invited to come up on the roof of the Longacre building, about 40 people from the press and so forth. And so it was. It all went well until about halfway through the play, when a frantic engineer rushed up to Baird and said, "The screen is melting with its own heat. We must stop it." And I said to Baird, "We can't with all these people." And he was very characteristically, he just turned to the engineer and he said very gently but firmly, "Tell them to go right ahead and let it melt." And at the end, the screen was like one of those great set pieces there used to be in firework displays at the Crystal Palace, tremendously sort of luminous and sparkling and disintegrating.
Meanwhile, Baird continued with his demonstrations, piling novelty upon novelty.
July 1930. Baird becomes part of the show at the London Coliseum, demonstrating television on a large 5-foot by 2-foot screen with George Robey amongst the performers.
January 1931. Baird presents Zone Television, projecting full-length figures onto a screen, including Herbert Strudwick, the England wicketkeeper, giving cricket lessons.
8th of May, 1931. Baird transmits a street scene in normal daylight.
June the 3rd, Baird succeeds in transmitting the Derby.
At least after a fashion, with a commentary provided by one of his assistants, Barton Chappell.
Well, the most important experiment for the Derby was where we had the 3 zones of 30 lines side by side, so as to get a large picture in the cinema 10 foot by 7 foot. We could only work during the night because the cinema was in use during the day, so we had to rely on the tests that we were able to conduct on the Sunday before the Derby so as to see a daylight transmission. One of the staff managed to persuade a horse to pass in front of our transmitter on the Epsom Downs, which of course was static. And we were all agog in the cinema to see what the horse looked like in these 3 zones. Well, we saw it, but it was a disembodied horse, because the first part we saw was the tail and the rear of the horse. Then we saw its head, and then we saw its middle. However, Baird was so excited that he'd seen a real picture that he took off his hat and threw it right up into the auditorium with complete excitement.
Undaunted, Baird clung to mechanical systems. In September 1931, he told an audience in America,
"There is no hope for television by means of a cathode ray tube."
He was wrong, and others knew he was wrong. Early in 1931, at Hayes in Middlesex, a new company had been formed with the merger of the Gramophone Company and Columbia. Its name was Electric and Musical Industries Limited, EMI. At first, the new company's only interest was in receivers, but before long they decided to challenge the Baird television system all along the line. To make that challenge, in this building was assembled one of the finest industrial research groups the world has ever seen. At the head of it, EMI's Director of Research, Isaac Schoenberg.